Well, this is a presentation that I prepared for one of the other regions who asked me to do some work to help orient them concerning the remit. So what's at issue in the remit is that the church is being called to give space to the National Indigenous Circle, sometimes called the National Indigenous Organization, so that they can continue to construct their governance framework. And what this remit does is it basically clears the way in the church structure so that we can properly create something that reflects the governance of the Indigenous Church and its relationship to General Council and the General Council Executive. Now, in order to understand why this is important, you really have to understand the history. And for me, when I looked at the history, all I could think of was it really is a story of 2 steps forward, 1 step back throughout the church's history. So some significant dates that you should probably have tucked away in your head. The first Methodist mission of the of the Methodist Church actually was in Grand River in Southern Ontario, and it was in 1825. Now note that that church was 100 years old when church union started. The difficult part for me about church union, which was so celebratory in many ways, was that the Indigenous churches were not asked whether they wanted to join union or not. They were literally moved as a whole by the stroke of the pen of the Methodist superintendent. So they really were treated like children in this process. And a lot of complicated stuff happened thereafter. They lost the ability to control their churches and really were treated as if they were new missions, which was not a good thing. And you should note that the struggle for autonomy in the United Church really started in the Indigenous Church at Church Union. The next sort of big date to hold in your head is 1948. And this is one of those steps forward. The United Church actually put a brief forward to the Parliamentary Committee on the Reform of the Indian Act and was very clear back then that residential schools were not a good idea, that in fact, it was not in keeping with the treaties and the agreements that had been kept, and we needed to get out of the business of residential schools. It should, and just an aside, you might be interested in knowing, and we've got a diaconal ministry person here, so I want to hold that up. Catherine Hawken, who was trained at Covenant College, a precursor of the Center for Christian Studies, was saying by the late 40s, we need to be out. We need not to do that. And she was a very vocal critic of the residential schools. And I find that interesting because she actually started her teaching career in Awuset residential school. So she knew from the inside out what she was talking about. So we said we wanted to get out of the business of residential schools, but we didn't actually do it. Our last school closed in '69. So again, our talk was far ahead of our action. The 1960s, as you know, was the time of the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Movement, while it was started in the African American community, spilled over in all kinds of ways. And in the 60s, you have the development of the American Indian movement, the Indian Brotherhood. There are a number of organizations. And it's just an aside, it's kind of interesting that one of the 2 co-founders of the American Indian movement was Eddie Benton Benet, who would eventually lead the reformation of the Medewan Lodge and the traditional teaching of the Anishinaabe people. Same fella in politics and spirituality. By 1977, the United Church felt they had enough experience, about 50 years of work with Indigenous people. And so they did the first review of the working relationship between the two bodies. And almost immediately after that, they started a series of national Indigenous consultations where every year to two, they would have people come from across the country from the various Indigenous United Churches to talk about and dream about what an Indigenous church would look like. Over the timescale of the 80s, from 1980 to 1987, you had the formation of the Dr. Jesse Soto Center in Winnipeg, the Francis Sandy Theological Center in Paris, Ontario. You also had the formation of the Indigenous program at the Vancouver School of Theology. They all happened within a few years of each other. Right in the middle of the 80s, of course, we had the first apology. And the apology is kind of interesting because this was not an apology that was given by the church spontaneously. This was an apology that was demanded from the Indigenous church. And Elder Alberta Billy, who just passed away this past year, stood at a general council and said, you need to apologize for your part in the destruction of our communities. And so 1986, then moderator Bob Smith got up and apologized. And it's important to note, again, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The apology was given, but it was not received. It was not accepted. It was acknowledged. And basically, what the Indigenous church said is, show us by your action that you really are sorry. One of the first concrete actions after the apology was the formation of the All Native Circle Conference. And I can't stress enough how important that was to the Indigenous communities. For the first time in the United Church of Canada, Indigenous people had the opportunity to organize a conference based on their principles, and they had circles across the country, 4 of them that worked, one in BC, one in the West, one in Ontario, and one in the Keewatin in northern Manitoba. And this really was important. They had a grand council, and their ways of working were conciliar and consensual. So very different than the settler church, which works on the principles of Bernot and how they function. 4 years after that, we had the first Indigenous moderator, the Right Reverend Stan McKay. And I love that I can say the first Indigenous, now that we have our second Indigenous moderator right now, Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne. Right after that, the next step forward was the formation of the Healing Fund. And that was a fund that was to underwrite healing and language recovery in the communities that we had served in. But again, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because the goal for the Healing Fund was to raise $1 million. While we raised $4 million for the AIDS in Africa campaigns, which were very important, we never did make it to $1 million for the Healing Fund. We could support healing overseas, but when push came to shove, we didn't raise the funds that we had committed. Less than 2 years later, the first residential school court case begins in Port Alberni, and the church finds itself in court and supporting the Indigenous folks on the ground in Port Alberni. So we were literally, for the first time, against ourselves in court. This led to the 1998 apology, which was specifically for our behavior and our participation in the residential schools. We did the apology in 1988, but it's important for us to note that the church actually fought against the court cases and appealed at each step of the way. That doesn't impress me as an Indigenous person and as a person who believes that the church is in the business of social justice, but it's what we did. Finally, 8 years later, the United Church signed the Indian Residential Schools Agreement. 2 years later, the next step happens in the Indigenous Church's formation, and an Aboriginal Ministries Circle is formed at the General Council offices. This is the first time that there's a standalone department to manage at the time what they called Aboriginal ministries. We had always been a department of home missions up until then. A few years later, the Sandy Soto Spiritual Center is formed. Again, it looks like a step forward, but it's actually the collapsing of the Dr. Jesse Soto Center and the Francis Sandy Center together for economic reasons. And while it works, it does not work well to try and train people from across the country in one program. Then we took another step forward. We made a change to the United Church crest. That was more about us than it was about the Indigenous Church. But there was a formal recognition for the first time that the Indigenous Church was part of the United Church of Canada. 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation process, the commission concludes. One thing I am proud of was that the United Church was present at every gathering that was held by the TRC, and they acted as witnesses who literally sat with survivors and listened to them tell their stories. And there were clergy and laity alike who did that task. It was a very humbling task for our folks to do, but incredibly important. 2019 then, church restructuring happens. And church restructuring was hard on a lot of people. It was extremely hard on the Indigenous Church because, again, the regions were created and All Native Circle Conference was collapsed along with the others, but nobody listened to the fact that the Indigenous Church, those who were part of the All Native Circle Conference, didn't want that to happen. And what they're doing now with the National Indigenous Council is to try and recreate a lot of the structure that they had with the All Native Circle Conference in a way that is healthy for the Indigenous Church. And part of forming the National Indigenous Council was they have formed an executive, the National Indigenous Council, and then they also formed an elders organization, the National Elders Council. The National Indigenous Council is elected and serves on a 3-year basis, just like the General Council executive. The National Elders Council are appointed by their communities, and they serve as long as they feel that they are able to in that council. It's taken a lot of work since 2019 to even get us to the point we are now. And people were starting to trust that this new National Indigenous Circle was going to work. And then in 2021, of course, the 215 were found at Kamloops, and it eroded the Indigenous trust in the church once again. And here we are, 2022, Carmen Lansdowne is elected moderator, and we have a remit before the church. Some people have asked, why now? And what I have heard folks in the Indigenous church say is, it's time for a different kind of relationship. We have to move away from this concept of missions to the Indians towards being partners in God's call to all the earth. You'll note behind me on my screen, the 2-row wampum belt. And this wampum belt speaks of a covenant between the settlers and Indigenous people. And the concept is that there are two groups of people traveling down a river, and each is in their own canoe. Respectfully, it's all we can do to paddle our own canoe. We don't need to try and paddle someone else's canoe. First of all, you tip. Second of all, we need to respect who we are, each other, and we need to allow one another to simply be who we are in all our complexity. The settler church has all kinds of complexity and ethnicities, newcomers, there's all kinds of different ways that the church is complex. But respectfully, so too is the Indigenous church. There are hundreds of different nations speaking many different languages. And sometimes it's all we can do to manage the diversity within our own canoe. And so this new way of being church is to allow each other to walk side by side without meddling in each other's affairs. So here we come to the remit. This is a really interesting thing. It's a preemptive remit. And this is the first time we've ever done that. And basically what the General Secretary had in mind was a way to clear the path so that the Indigenous church could continue their work of forming themselves in a decolonial manner without having to come hat in hand to the settler church saying, okay, we've done this, can we do this? There's been much amusement in the Indigenous church where they talk about the fact we're going to try to stop fitting a round peg into a flow chart of boxes. The Indigenous church works in a circle and they work on consensus, and it does not work in the way our General Council format is designed. Now, here are some questions that may be asked, and a colleague of mine, Reverend Ryan McNally, pulled the information together for this. And these are some of the questions that we expect that are going to surface as councils and official boards start to ask questions about the remit. First of all, they're going to want to know, who is this Indigenous church? And as I've just said to you, Indigenous identity is really complex. There are more or less 66 communities of faith, from Kanesatake and Kanawaki in the east to Haida Gwaii in the west. On average, that's in or about 1,000 worshipers on a Sunday morning. And you need to know that there are an incredible number of tribes and nations and communities and clans and language, and they all sort of move around each other. Often even land is overlapped between nations. If you've never seen it, this is a map demonstrating the complexity of the languages that are spoken in the Indigenous communities. As you can see, it's pretty widespread. And this will give you an idea of the number of nation groupings that that are here in our space. So one of the questions is, why doesn't the National Indigenous Circle come up with the structure first so we can know what we're voting on? Fair question. Looking back at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Article 4 says, Indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. The United Church signed on to UNDRIP. Article 12 says that Indigenous people have the right to manifest, practice, develop, and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies, the right to maintain, protect, and have access and privacy to their religious and cultural sites, the right to the use and control of their ceremonial objects, and the right to the repatriation of their human remains. I do note where it says spiritual and religious traditions, that there is a portion of the Indigenous Church who considers their traditional teaching to be Christian, and they don't want to go back to an earlier understanding of their spiritual traditions. That's part of the complexity and diversity of the church these days. Also from UNDRIP, Article 25 says Indigenous people have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas, and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. That's the basis of why we've been doing land acknowledgements, is Article 25. The TRC in Action 48 asks the United Church and other church parties and other faith and social justice groups to, quote, formally adopt and comply with the principles, norms, and standards of UNDRIP as a framework for reconciliation. And what we're called to do is to ensure that our institutions, policies, programs, and practices comply, that we respect Indigenous people's right to self-determination in spiritual matters, that we engage in ongoing public dialogue and actions to support the concepts in the Declaration, and to issue a statement detailing how they will implement the statement in their context. And the United Church as a whole has done that last piece. The United Church statement on accepting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was passed as a framework for reconciliation in 2016. So, you know, already we're looking at, what, 7 years ago. And in the statement, it says that we understand that the principles, norms, and standards of the Declaration are reflected in the right to self-determination, the right to cultural and spiritual identity, the right to participate in decision-making, the right to lands and resources, the right to free, prior, and informed consent, and the right to be free from discrimination. Next question. So why doesn't the settler church ask the Indigenous church to develop a structure first? Because we've already declared that the Indigenous church has both a right to self-determination and a right to cultural and spiritual identity of their own. They don't need to come to the settler church. Now, and this is a big one, is the purpose of this remit to create a separate church? No, is the short answer. The idea is to create an autonomous entity within the United Church of Canada. Yes, there will be a tension between autonomy and control. And here comes my two-row wampum concept. The Haudenosaunee speak of the two-row wampum. This covenant speaks of our two peoples traveling down a river, each in their own canoe. And with respect, we need to allow one another to simply be who we are. It's time to remember this covenant and work as two bodies side by side in all our complexity. We also said, we stressed in dialogue with the wider church that the Indigenous church is not separating or breaking away from the settler church. We are moving forward on a nation-to-nation basis. We're moving away, as I said before, from the concept of Indian missions to being partners in God's call to the earth. Is the purpose to create a separate church? Well, just as I said, no, it's going to be autonomous within the church. Yes, there will be a separate church in that they will have their right to exercise their own self-determination. No, because we're going to stay in relationship and we're going to work to a better nation-to-nation relationship. No, in that the Indigenous church will continue to exist within the legal framework of the United Church of Canada. This is really a case of both and, not either or. Will this lead to the breakup of the UCC into many different entities with different rules? Will other cultural groups want to do the same thing? We want to be clear that this remit is about the National Indigenous Organization and the path of reconciliation and self-determination that we're on. It's based on the TRC and the United Nations Declaration. Should another group want to do something similar, it would require another kind of process and a different remit. So this is specifically focusing on the Indigenous church. Now, it's good to acknowledge that there are tensions within the settler church. There are some who see this as the end of the church. There are others who think this is a right and good development in our ongoing development as the United Church of Canada. We are not in the settler church of one mind on this any more than the Indigenous church is on their side of the fence. Will there be limits on the autonomy being granted to the Indigenous organization? Well, the short answer is that the National Indigenous Organization will determine its own structures and processes through its own methods on its own timeline. So in that respect, no, there's no autonomy, other than the fact we're quite intentionally staying within the United Church of Canada. The calls to the church, which again, the United Church accepted some years ago, say, we will say what Indigenous ministry is, we will do Indigenous theology, and we will say who we are. And the General Council has agreed to that. The settler church, even with Indigenous participation, will not determine the structure and processes of the National Indigenous Organization. Now, will there be limits on that autonomy? Well, there are already some limitations in that there are possible areas of joint action and decision-making. For example, there's covenants between particular Indigenous communities of faith, the National Indigenous organizations, and some of the settler regional councils. That's already happening. There's cooperation between those. There's some aspects of credentialing of clergy to the extent that clergy move between the Indigenous and settler church. Those limitations and rules are already in place. And there's the basis of union on doctrine. If there were to be dramatic changes in doctrine, the Indigenous church is still party to the basis of union. And something called, and this is sort of beyond my scope, but the model trust deed applies also to Indigenous communities of faith, as it does to every other church. And the pension fund, the benefits plan, the educational pathways, our publishing arm are all pieces of our church life that are shared and will continue to be shared between these two wings of the church. Will the National Indigenous Organization be able to adopt policies different from general UCC policies? Well, yes, is the short answer, because it has the power to make policy in the areas in which they're autonomous. So if there are things that are by, for, and contextual to the Indigenous church, then yes, they will be able to make policy changes that might be different from the settler church. Is there a fear about policies contrary to the United Church policies? Well, quite frankly, folks, there is already an incredible degree of freedom in a variety of areas that has already been granted to regional councils and communities of faith. We are not of one like mind across the country in just about anything. What we talk about the United Church being as is a big tent, right? With lots of room within that tent for most, if not all, people. Now here comes the real sticky one. So how is all this going to be financed? You know, and of course, the underlying question is, who's going to pay for this? It's important to note that the remit doesn't speak about finances at all. However, here's some things to consider. Indigenous people are more likely to experience poverty than any other group in Canada. The example was given of Winnipeg, where 16% of Indigenous persons live in poverty, compared to 8.4% of the non-Indigenous persons. And if you open up to talk about Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people, you're up to about 24% living in poverty in Winnipeg. Almost 1 in 6 Indigenous people live in a dwelling needing major repairs, as opposed to 5.7% of the non-Indigenous population. 17% of Indigenous people live in crowded dwellings, compared to 9.4% of the non-Indigenous population. That's from the 2020 census data. Here's what the costs are. In 2014, the Indigenous church communities of faith cost about $635,222 to operate. Oh, sorry, no, not to operate. That was their income, as opposed to $384,993,716 in the settler church. The settler church has an income of over 600 times larger than the Indigenous church at the community of faith level. Put it in a pie chart, and I'm grateful to my colleague for this. Looking at the expenditures, this white area is governance and shared services, which was just over 14.5 million. That little tiny thin pink strip, that's the 192,000 that is spent on the Indigenous church governance. Mission and ministry in the church, yeah, 17,500 $506,000. And of the Indigenous Church and Right Relations, and to know that Indigenous ministry refers to services to and for our Indigenous members, whereas Right Relations is actually about interactions with of the Indigenous Church with settlers. So the work that we do in our social justice work, that's also included in this $4,467,000. So, maybe 2/3 of that is actually the Indigenous Church. But it gives you an idea of how the monies are spread out. Basically, what people are saying in my final comment about the payment is it costs us a drop in the bucket to help fund the Indigenous Church. It may be at some time in the future that they will be more independent financially, but that's a down the road conversation. What I'd like to leave you with is the notion that your pastoral charges participation matters. If a pastoral charge votes no, obviously it's a no. If they vote yes, it's a yes. But if a pastoral charge simply doesn't reply, that's counted as a no vote. So it's really important that the council takes action. And that brings me to the end of my presentation.